Okay, so to begin creating our shockwaves, I'm just going to drop in an XP system, and we already have an emitter in there. So what we're going to do is make this a circle. I'm going to change the emitter plane to Y+, change the cone angle to 90%, and hit ring only. Now when you hit play, you're going to have all these particles spraying out in the kind of pattern that we want. In the emission, we will change that to shot, and we will change this to about 50. We don't want too many. Now if you hit play now, you're just going to see less particles, and they're all going to shoot out at once. So what we're going to do is now use this as a source to create a explosion simulation, or pyro simulation, whatever you want to call it. So if you right click on that, Insidium tags, ExplosiaFX source, and then you come to dynamics and we drop in ExplosiaFX. Now when we hit play, nothing's going to happen. So what we need to do is come back into that emitter, come into extended data, physical data, and just crank that fuel parameter up. Now you're going to see something happening. But it doesn't look quite like a shockwave yet. So what we need to do is work on that. So we'll come back to the emission, and we're going to crank up the speed a little bit, maybe about 500, and we'll bring up the radius to about 12. Now if we play that back, looks like a shockwave. But we need to make that bounding box a lot bigger because it's kind of killing itself a little bit too early on. And I'll just give it all 2000 in each direction. So now we hit play. So now we have a decent looking shockwave. We're going to change a couple more things before we advect any particles. So if you come to this tag here and you see the velocity, maybe crank that up to about 400. That's also kind of going to increase the look of it looking like a shockwave. Now a couple of the kind of important things you're going to be coming back to continuously tweak and make this your own is going to be the velocity, and it's going to be kind of the smoke and the fuel, and I'll just turn that up a little bit, and it's going to be the speed and the radius, and occasionally the shot count. Those things are going to be your main controller. You're not really going to be changing anything drastic in here. Maybe the voxel size, but I know your mind is going to expect it to tweak the way this looks. It's going to be to change stuff in here. Nope. It's going to be your velocity, it's going to be your speed, your radius, and your shot count, and kind of your variation and stuff here as well. That will change the look. The stuff in here, I would largely kind of ignore it, and we'll come to that as we may need it. Okay, so now we have our shockwave kind of set up. It looks quite nice. What we can do is call this emitter. We'll call it Explosia. So now we're going to create another emitter. I'm going to call this emitter Advected. Okay, so with this emitter, this is going to be the emitter that has the actual particles that's going to get pushed, and it's going to look like a shockwave. So if we come back to the beginning here and we set this to shot, and I'm going to hit 2 more zeros in that, so 100,000. Okay, and we're going to turn the speed all the way down. That's crucial. Keep that speed down, otherwise it won't do its job. Now we come to object. I'm going to make this a torus. Now let's scale this up a little bit, and then we can kind of tweak the radius of that torus here. We want to give it a little bit of space between where the particles come out of that circle and when they hit the torus. So if I hit play here and pause, you're going to see that all the particles spawn in on frame 1. This fire is going to come out and it's going to push those particles. Those particles are going to take the shape of the fire. That's going to give us the shockwave. So if we hit play right now, that's not going to happen. So what we need to do is come up to the ExplosiaFX, come to the Advection tab, and then hit Advect Particles. But before we hit play, you need to come back to that Explosia emitter, come to modifiers, and drag that in so it cancels itself out. Now what this is going to stop from happening is the very particles that we're sourcing the Explosia and the pyro simulation from, we're stopping them from kind of reading the advection and trying to advect themselves and bugging out, and then nothing works. So I'm just hit play now, and you can see the fire pushes the particles. So if we now turn that off in the viewport, maybe come to that top view. It looks like we have a shockwave. That looks pretty cool. So, what's some things we could do to tweak this? It looks pretty good right now. There might not be a whole bunch more you want to do. One thing you could do is change the gravity here and put a minus on it. Sometimes you'll see the fire can have a tendency to kind of dip down and ravel in on itself. Sometimes it can look cool to have it going up. I'm going to leave it default right now, but just know that as a parameter you could target. Another thing we can do is if we come to the emission here, generally the kind of look that I liked, and when we move into art direction I will kind of go into this more, I liked kind of 300,000 to 500,000. That looks nice, I like it. You can see nice motion blur and stuff on it. You can come up to about 3 million, 5 million, 6 million, but they end up looking a lot like stock effects, and that's cool. Like if that's what you want, you could do that, you could create that kind of thing, but I like it looking very particular, if you know what I mean. So if we come to 400,000, we're going to see this here. It's going to look a bit more glued together. Nonetheless, it's still going to look nice. I'll probably do about 250, 300 when we come to rendering. But in terms of playback right now, I'm going to keep this at 100. So what's some other things we could do here right now? I'm just pausing the tutorial quickly to mention, you noticed me just then turn down the radius of the advected particle. Now by default that should be 3. I'm editing the tutorial back and I'm looking, I saw myself do something stupid about 2 minutes ago when I dropped in the advected particles object and I made it a torus. I scaled that up just by hitting T and scaling up. Don't do that, just mess with the parameters of the torus, otherwise it just scales up the particle radius by default. I don't think it makes a huge difference, but I think it was affecting some of my simulations just because by habit I tend to scale things like that. But just mentioning that if you did the same thing following the tutorial, make sure to bring that radius back down. Okay, thanks, bye. Let's have a look what happens if we crank that velocity up to like 800. Not much different. Let's have a look at what happens if we crank that speed up to like 900. It bugs out. It looks cool, but it bugs out. Now, a way to get around this can be to do Control D and come to your XParticles tab and change with the iterations here. Now, by default, these are going to be a little bit different. I'd already changed them, but one of the recordings crashed, so I'm kind of doing it again. But if you bring this to about like down to 2 or 1, and I think this is at like 2, if you bring this up to about 5 or 6, that can help, but it's not going to help a whole bunch. A way to kind of counter it can be to bring the velocity back down and counter it that way. So that can be a way to counter that. If you're going to bring the speed way up, bring the velocity back down a bit. I kind of like the look of having them equaled out. I think something like that, kind of somewhere around 500 for both of them, creates a really nice look. Now in terms of changing this look and kind of customizing it, you can bring the shot count up to 60, bring the radius up a little bit, bring the speed down, bring the variation up, and you're just going to get like a totally different look. It's really just tweaking these parameters, and it can be quite tedious, but nonetheless, it will change your look and give you different looks. Now, one last thing I'm going to do before we move on is come to the display tag and the advected particles, change the color mode to gradient parameter, and I'm going to set that to speed. Now we have something like a shockwave. So next up, I'm going to move into kind of doing a bit of look dev here and creating the initial look in Octane. This is where we're going to really see everything come together. So I'm just going to activate Octane right now, let that boot up. Okay, so let's fire up Octane, and I would assume if you've used XParticles before, you know how to bring them to life in Octane. I'm just going to create 248 by 248. That is quite a high resolution. You might want to do 1080 by 1080. Depends if you have the power for it. As you create this nice kind of square here, I'm gonna I've set it to path tracing. I'm just kind of doing this all without even noticing it. So I'm just gonna drop in a texture environment and I'm gonna black that out completely. And then in the advected, we're gonna add in a Octane object tag, come to particle rendering, make that geometry. We're not gonna see anything. That's because we don't have a light. I'm gonna drag in a light. I'm gonna push this way off to the side for a second. And we can see our particles, but they look disgusting. So we're going to drop in a sphere and set this to about 0.3. That didn't work. That didn't work. 0.3. And then what we're going to do, so we're going to drop in a sphere and we're going to set that radius to about 0.3. And we're going to drag that into the geometry here. Now that looks a little bit nicer. If we drop in a camera, hit the little box so we're in the camera, and then come to your parameters and coordinates of the camera, and hit 0 here, press tab, skip the Y, 0 on the Z, press it 3 times, 0, 0, enter. Now, oh, I'm going to make 90 minus, okay, and we're going to hit minus 90 here, and now we're looking down at our shockwave, and it looks cool. So I'm going to press F2, camera's perspective. Now I can kind of roam around here while our viewport stays in the same place. And I'm just gonna right click on the Octane light animation tags, target the XP system. We can drag that light around. Bring it up a bit. Now let's just drop in a glossy material. Make that yellow. Drop that on the sphere. And bring a bit of the color out of it. Now, this looks pretty cool, but what can we do to make it look better? So, we'll add an Octane camera tag there. Enable the camera imager. Turn on your highlight compression. A little bit of bloom. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom out a little bit. And we're going to come back into these particles. I'm going to change this to 300,000. It's kind of getting up there a little bit. And then we're just going to hit play. I'm going to pause on that. I can render this out. Okay, this looks a little bit better, but it's starting to look a little bit, something is not clean about it. Let's bring that radius down on the sphere. It's starting to look a little bit better again. Maybe do 0.15. Okay, nice. You see that LODs just kind of went up drastically. At this point, the way you want your shockwave to look, you're kind of going to want to lean into the shot count a lot. So if we wanted to get kind of what I mentioned when I said it looked like a stock effect, you know, we can just bump this up to say 1.3 million and I'll let that simulate there. Now if I give this a render and we take a look at how it's going to look, we're going to see instantly it's going to look a little bit kind of weird and a bit merged together. Although it's kind of a cool look, it almost looks kind of meshed. But if we drop this, say the radius down to 0.05, we're going to see now you're really kind of getting that look of it looking a bit like a stock effect. You can't really see any particles. It looks pretty awesome. You really might want to go for this. I think kind of doing this thing, this kind of look, and using a bunch of different colors through it. Kind of, for example, using these colors here. And on that note, I may as well show you that, and you most likely know how to do it, but we can drop in an instance color here, plug that into the diffuse, change the source to particle, drop in the advected, and we're going to get those colors, and we can just kind of do what we want with those colors, by piping in a gradient in the middle, and we could make it, you know, purple at the beginning, and then we could make it orange at the end, for example, and you can kind of play with it that way. But now I'm just going to leave it yellow. Now I have my settings back to around 300,000 right now, and if I hit render here and I start playing, what we're going to see is the first few frames look really ugly, just really not nice. So the way to fix that and to get a really smooth looking animation, just something else I can notice here is that sphere that we're using. You can see it. I'm just going to drag that out there so it's not kind of in the way. Now we'll come into modifiers and we'll choose a control modifier. And the modifier we're going to use is XpScale. Now if you change, or keep this as particle radius, we change the operation to set value. And then what we're going to do is come to mapping. We're going to add mapping. We're going to change this parameter to radius value. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to drag this up and kind of course, this is the life. This is mapped to the age. Now we don't really have an age, so this is just going to be the general timeline. So what we want is it to start off at a scale of 0, a radius of 0, and scale in over the first couple frames. So what that's going to look like now is we're not going to see anything. I'll pause it, and it'll start coming in. But we're not getting our simulation properly. Now again, it's the same thing as earlier with the Explosia. You want to drag the XpScale in, otherwise it's going to scale that. So we're going to come back to frame 0, and then we're going to let this play. And what you're going to see now is it starts off really small, and then it's going to blend in really smoothly, and it's going to look like those shockwaves I first made. So the last thing I'm going to show you now is how to retime this to create really nice quick motion that's going to give us and kind of really sell the look of the shockwave. We don't want this to be too slow and linear, which is going to be by default, and as we're going to cache this and then we're going to retime it. Through the retime, we're really going to clamp down most of the motion to the kind of first second, and then let the rest of the animation just going to play out really slow. So what we'll do is go to utilities and grab an XP cache, and then specify what folder you want it to go into. And straight off the bat here, just hit build cache. Okay, so once that's all done and cached, it seemed to take absolutely ages. Now what we can do is work on retiming this. So I'm just going to see how responsive this is. It's not too bad. You've seen these later frames. It's going to get quite ugly. It doesn't really look that nice. And if we are to play through it here, you can see probably only really want to use about a second of this. After that, we're not really getting much kind of advection in the position. They're kind of just sitting in the same place and kind of rotating a little bit. If they are moving, it's kind of within the same area. We're not kind of getting that distance of a shockwave. But what I want is to kind of capitalize on those first kind of, I would say about 25 to 30 frames where it is moving and kind of performing a shockwave motion. So what we're going to do is come to playback, and if you come to retiming, sorry, and if you change this to frame, I'm just going to turn off my taskbar here actually. Just noticed that. And we've got this set to frame, and then we come back to frame 0. Now the way this kind of method of retiming works is that now wherever we keyframe on the timeline, it's going to be at that frame, if that makes sense. So if I keyframe on frame 0 for it to be on frame 0, and then I come to the end and I change that to 90, of course we have 3 seconds here, so we have 90 frames. Now that's back to normal speed. But what we want to do is dramatically increase the speed of this. So what I'm going to do within about the first 10 frames or so, we can see it gets to about, I don't know, maybe a fourth of the way done, third of the way done. I probably want it by about, sorry again, I'm recovering from COVID, so if you hear me coughing, I recorded the rest of the tutorial like 2 weeks ago and then I got COVID, so I'm doing the rest now. I think what I want to do is come to about frame 10 and maybe put a keyframe about frame 10 or maybe frame 11. And then what we want to do is maybe make this do about, I don't know, maybe about 18 frames. So we have a look at this now. So that's going to shoot out quite quick. Okay, cool. But then what I want to do is come to that frame up at frame 90, but of course what we only want it to kind of scale up to about 25. So now if we watch this back, it's going to shoot out quick and then slow down. Really slow down. Maybe it's slowed down a little bit too much. I'm going to try 30 here and we'll watch that again. Okay, cool. So maybe I'll bring this forward a frame and we'll make it come up to about frame 20. Alright, in fact, maybe come down, maybe about frame 17, but quicker. Maybe 15. And now that's going to shoot out really quick and get slow. So if I try and watch that with the live viewer on, and kind of see what kind of things it does here. Okay. That's kind of going to give you a shockwave. I think this kind of retiming part is probably the most vital when it comes to the motion of getting your shockwave. I did kind of have a little play around and see how did it play out without this extra step, and you're just going to get a way better look doing it like this. It takes a little bit of tweaking, you know, rendering out an animatic. If I do that, call it animatic, render viewport, and all frames, and I won't save it. And if we pop out one of these, you kind of have to keep popping these out and then having a look at them, and then just kind of tweaking your parameters to see the kind of exact speed and motion that you want to get. Because if I play the back, I can kind of see how it's working properly, and that looks about right. In fact, it's actually a bit too fast, and that's one thing I would have never been able to pick up on in the viewport here. So I might even bring that down to about frame 24 or so, maybe frame 23, render it again, see how much it slows down. And if we play that back now, yeah, that's kind of more like it. That's the motion I was kind of chasing for each of the shockwaves I created. I would say this is pretty accurate. So maybe if you want to copy those settings there, 0 to frame 10, put it 5 frames above, and then make it do about 20, 23, 24, 25 frames. Of course, this is all kind of going to be accurate to your settings back before we cached, amid the velocity and the speed and whatnot. But if you followed the tutorial accurately, those parameters won't be that different. So I think I'm probably going to wrap up the tutorial there. I can't really think of anything else that's really worth going over. A couple things I kind of wanted to add to the tutorial, but feel like I'm probably wasting time, maybe just tweaking parameters here and there. But then again, you can do that yourself. Just mess with it, learn what's the right parameters to tweak for the kind of look that you want to get. Maybe mess with adding grain effects to it and messing with different colors. You can really get a whole bunch of different looks here. So thanks for watching this tutorial. The assets, as I mentioned, will be on the store, the project files and whatnot. So if you kind of want to skip the the tedious parts, or you get a bit annoyed or whatever, you can just jump straight into these kind of shockwave setups and check out my other tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one.